This video is part 3 of Chapter 6, Thinking and Intelligence for PSY 110S, the Psychological Sciences. As we're shifting now to the topic of intelligence, which to me, it's always a really fraught, confusing, anxiety-provoking, sometimes anger-provoking set of conversations, largely because there's rarely agreement, even among psychological scientists, on what exactly we mean by intelligence. Every person that you meet, whether they're a scientist or not, whether they're a cognitive psychologist or not, whether they're a developmental psychologist or not, is going to have their own personal kind of definition of what it means to be intelligent, and even more importantly, what it means to not be intelligent. So what we have to try to do in psychological science is come up with some ways of putting parameters on this concept that's very broad, very controversial, very difficult to define. As this comic that I've put here on the rest suggests, there are lots of different ways for people to be smart. There are lots of ways in which people behave in their worlds that suggest their brilliance, but may not fit with someone else's view of brilliance. So most of us have a pretty good sense of what we believe intelligence is. And all of us can recognize people who are good at thinking, people who solve problems really well, people who get very good grades, people who appear to be socially incredibly adept. There are lots of different ways of being intelligent. Finding a definition that psychologists can agree on, though, is really, really difficult. The bias in psychology has tended to be in favor of dominant groups, basically. The people who are doing the science tend to be academics. They tend to be in that academic world. So there tends to be a drift in the direction of academically based skills that can be tested and verified using academic type measures. So a lot of our measures of intelligence are biased in terms of those skills that make you successful in school. And then by translation, successful in areas of work that value those skills. What many critics argue, though, that's just a very narrow bandwidth of the human experience. So we need a broader definition. So defining intelligence is very controversial. Even more controversial is the way in which intelligence tests have been used, sometimes for political purposes, sometimes for frankly horrific purposes. So we'll need to explore a little bit of this history to contextualize what we know and what we don't know about human intelligence. So going way, way back in the Wayback Machine, before Galton started to do the work that he did, and he was primarily motivated by what's called eugenics. In the early days of the study of genetics and evolution, there were some who believed that this newfound science of genetics could be used to improve the human race. And if that sort of sends a chill up your spine, it should. People like Adolf Hitler and many other people of his ilk have tended to believe that you could engineer a better human race through basically selective breeding. So Galton was motivated by eugenics. He believed that intelligence or intellect was determined by our genetic endowment. So he went kind of all in and tried to find ways. At that time, when Galton was doing what he was doing, we didn't have sophisticated statistics, like correlational statistics didn't exist until Carl Pearson formalized Galton's ideas in order to test some of his theories. What Galton argued was that intelligence could be determined using very simple measures, things like brain circumference or something like that. So he developed these tests, beyond simple external measurements. He did tests of sensory abilities, reaction time, and a variety of other mathematics tasks that eventually became related to correlational statistics. He subjected, his subjects to tests of their sensory abilities, their reaction times, and then worked with people like his student Carl Pearson to find ways of testing whether or not they were related to these other abilities that were seen as valuable in culture. What was found was that the measures that they were using were not particularly good predictors of intelligence. So he wanted to be able to say, based on these very simple tests, this person is worth our time and energy. This person, on the other hand, is dangerous to us and should be kept apart. So that's part of the ugly history of intelligence testing, is that while it kind of was operating under the guise of science, and in fact produced some scientific outcomes, in this case, a statistical test that we use all the time, the motives of the people involved were not necessarily pure. After Galton, intelligence testing moved on to a more educational-based location. Alfred Binet, originally in France, he wanted to, and I believe you'd have to fact check me on this for the exact details. He was really invested in, after compulsory education was in place in France, he noted that there were some individuals who appeared to be behind and were not successful in school. And it would be helpful, he believed, to produce a metric, a test, that could identify people likely to struggle in school. So Binet and Simon developed the first test of intelligence in order to diagnose kids who were likely to be quote-unquote subnormal, meaning kids who would likely fail school. And his argument was he wanted to use these diagnoses not to exclude or to punish or to otherwise treat badly people who were likely to score poorly in school. He wanted to actually create interventions at a time when that was not part of school yet. So he helped in the development of what he called mental orthopedics, these mental exercises designed to improve cognition. And he tended to lean in the direction not so much of the genetic side of the argument, but he believed that there was something missing in these children's educations that could be made up for. That if we identify kids early who are likely to struggle, we can intervene and make things better. Now, as your authors note, the irony is that the test wasn't used in France widely until long after it had originally been used or developed. So it wasn't used until the 40s, and only that only happened when a French social worker who had been in the United States brought the American version back to France for deployment. Now, what this approach that was originally pioneered by Binet and Simon involved was identifying this concept called mental age. And it really only works for children. Children are growing, developing. We assume a set of benchmarks that they're going to pass cognitively in terms of their motor skills, in terms of their socio-emotional development, and so on. Intelligence was assumed to be no different. So the idea was that the remediation was required when mental age was lower than chronological age. And, some have argued it should really just be cognitive age or problem-solving age, because that's what a lot of these tests involved, was very, very school-based types of skills and knowledge. And when kids scored lower on those tests than was typical of their age, then they were assumed to require remediation. Now, shifting to Louis Terman, Terman was at Stanford University and had used Binet and Simon's test and then revised it for American school children because, a lot of these intelligence tests include knowledge of your cultural context. So he revised it so it was more relevant to Americans. And that became the Stanford Binet test. He used what's now become the classic intelligence quotient, or IQ, formula that was developed by someone named Stern. And basically, the IQ score is calculated by knowing the person's mental age, which is based on their score on the intelligence test, divide that by the chronological age, and then multiply by 100. When a child's age, as assessed by the test, was greater than when their mental age was greater than the chronological age, then their IQ would be above the mean, which was 100. So that was set as the standard. 100 was set as the normative standard. And if you were advanced as a child, so your mental age was bigger than your chronological age, then you were brighter than the average bear. If it was the reverse, not as bright as the average bear. So the difficulty comes from a number of places. I mean, there are a lot of criticisms you could make of the IQ measure. When children's mental age is assessed using tests, and their mental age is lower, that could indicate that that child has developmental disabilities or learning challenges. But it could also mean that perhaps that child is unfamiliar or uncomfortable with the testing situation. It could mean that that child uses English as a second language and doesn't understand the test. It may mean that some of the knowledge-based questions that are being asked are irrelevant to that child's cultural context. So there are a lot of possible reasons why mental age could be lower than chronological age. The IQ formula, as it was originally designed, is no longer really used for diagnostic purposes. It's what researchers call a confounded measure. Basically, what that means is a year's growth, even in childhood, isn't a reliable predictor of changes developmentally in mental ability. Kids vary widely, and then once you get beyond childhood, those variabilities get more complex. So essentially, what some critics argue is that mental growth levels off, but age keeps growing. So intelligence test scores, how they're computed, really needs to be carefully reconsidered. So that leads us to the work of Weschler, who noted that the IQ formula was especially problematic for use in adults because at some point your mental age is going to level off, but you're going to keep getting older. So that means that IQ number is less and less relevant. It's less and less useful for making any kind of decisions that you might want to make. So, based on the Stanford Binet, IQ would start going down with age, regardless of your actual mental abilities. which was, part of that mythology that people get less and less intelligent the older they get, which is actually false. So Wechsler developed his own tests. At the time, he was a chief psychologist at Bellevue Hospital in New York in the 30s, and he was tasked with doing assessments on thousands of adults from very widely diverse backgrounds. So, 1930s New York. You have lots of immigrants, lots of people speaking lots of different languages, from lots of different countries, different backgrounds, rich, poor, a whole melting pot. He needed standardized ways to do this. He was a dedicated believer that nurture was more powerful than nature. So he was less prone to sort of the genetic eugenics arguments of the past, and was more interested in identifying issues that people may have that would influence their ability to be successful. So he developed his own tests. Originally it was called the Wechsler-Bellevue scale. Later this was re-tagged as the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, the WAIS, and it's been modified for children. The Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children is still in modified forms in use. It's called the WISC. So what he argued, what he wanted this to involve, was not just these verbal tests, but a battery of tests for verbal skills, including vocabulary and comprehension, but also performance tasks that are nonverbal, block design tasks, picture arrangement tasks, and a lot of these tasks are still used and used in other contexts for neuropsychological evaluations as well. The WAIS includes individual scores for verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, working memory, and processing speed. So some of these parts of these tests, if any of you have ever had testing done for ADHD, for example, the tests of working memory and processing speed are particularly important for that kind of diagnosis. So he wanted a more concrete, more diagnostically important, or not important, diagnostically relevant way of measuring a variety of both verbal and performance-based tasks. Now, still, he's honing in on some very specific types of abilities that tend to be valued in an educational context. Problem solving, verbal skills, and so on, including spatial reasoning, which are very school-based kinds of skills to learn. Now, when we go back to the IQ idea, Wechsler argued that you needed some ways of standardizing IQ scores that go beyond the original IQ formula. So Terman had standardized the Stanford Binet on American children at various ages, and the goal was to compare the child's raw score with the standardized norms to calculate the mental age. Wechsler went on to collect standardized data for various adult age groups and then create a normal distribution for each age group. So what standardization involves is allowing the test scores to be interpreted in terms of norms. So what is the normal range for scores within a particular age group? And the way you derive that is by giving whatever your test is, to thousands and thousands of people and establishing what's the normative response or the normative score for people in that group. And then you can determine, so you have the whole group, then you can determine, how far above or below the mean for that group is one individual. And that way, you've standardized the test. So the test has to be given to a representative sample of the population you're interested in, and then the scores for that sample serve as norms against which you compare your individual responses. Now, why this matters is because a lot of times when we're doing educational assessments, trying to, I mentioned ADHD earlier. If you're talking about working memory and speed of processing, those are, one of the symptom categories for ADHD. You need to know, is your individual person, is their score above what's normed for that group, for their age group, below what's normed for that age group, or right around that age group. So if you're talking about trying to make a diagnosis, you would need to see that that person is meaningfully deviating from the norm for their particular group. Now, deviation scores, if you drag yourself back, I know it would be painful to do so, to that chapter where we talked about the normal distribution, standardizing IQ scores using the WAIS involves creating a normal distribution around a group norm, which would be the mean for the population. And what you see from this is that the vast majority of people fall within 1 or 2 standard deviations of the mean. So 68 and change % of people fall within 1 standard deviation of the mean. 95% fall within 2 standard deviations above and below the mean. So deviation IQ scores for the WAIS show us how those percentages diminish the farther you get away from the mean. To make deviation scores resemble IQ scores, the mean was just sort of arbitrarily set at 100. And the deviation, the standard deviation, was set at 15. So, if a student, for instance, on the working memory portions of the test is hitting -2, so 30 points below the norm for their age group, that would be cause for concern that that person has a memory deficit that may be improved by academic intervention. Now, some things that you need to think about with intelligence testing are the ways in which these scales, these tests, are validated and assessed. Because a test, any test, if it's going to be worth using, has to be reliable. Reliability refers to the degree to which you can get consistent scores within a population. So inside my population, I should be able to, if I use this test over and over again, I should get the same distribution of scores within that same population. Also, if you give the test using a test-retest reliability method, if you give it twice to the same sample and then calculate a correlation between the 2 sets of scores, it should be pretty darn high in order for you to say that that particular test is reliable. So a reliable test yields a strong positive correlation. Now, another type of reliability is called alternate form reliability. So what some people will do when they're validating and developing tests is to create 2 different versions or more than that of a test assessing the same skills, concepts, knowledge, abilities, whatever, and then give those alternate forms to the same sample at different times and then calculate the correlation between the scores. Again, test is going to be reliable if you have a strong positive correlation between the 2 scores. And then finally you have split half reliability. Reliability is determined in this case by splitting the test itself in half often, randomly splitting up the test into two. So you give the test to your sample, and then before you do the data analysis, you're going to split the data in half for each individual, and then you're going to run correlations between the two halves. And that provides you, like if you took the odd and even numbered items, you should, again, if your measure is reliable, it should show the same distribution of scores regardless of which items are being used. Now, another way that you show the value of a particular instrument is by it being valid. Validity is the degree to which the measure that you've designed actually does what it's supposed to do, which measures what you say it measures, predicts what it's supposed to predict. So in the case of intelligence tests, you have to define what you mean by intelligence and then demonstrate that the thing you are measuring with, the tool that you've designed, actually does what you say it does. So one way we do this is by assessing what's called content validity. And let's say you take a big test in a bio class, and the test is over, boy, I shouldn't have used the example of biology. Let's say you're studying how cells function. So you want to know, if you're giving them a test on how cells function, that you've hit all of the relevant areas that were covered in the material in the class leading up to that exam. If that is the case, that's high content validity. Another type of validity is something called predictive validity. So does the test that you've given relate to what it's supposed to be related to? So let's say you have an IQ test, like the WAIS or the WISC, and you want to use that as a predictor of success in college. So you give high school seniors the test, and then you come back after their first year of college, and you want to see if there's correlation between their IQ scores and their first year college GPA. That if that in fact that correlation is in fact there and it's significant and it's positive, then you can state that you have good predictive validity based on the ability of the test to predict outcomes. So we do this with SAT and ACT type scores. So when students take that test, the assumption is it's going to be a valid predictor of success the first year of college. And it's a reasonably decent predictor, but the farther away you get from that first year, the less good a predictor SAT and ACT scores are. If a test is valid, so if you have good validity, then that tends to also mean that you will have high reliability. The reverse is not always true, though, which as a logic test, I struggled with this when I was in school at first. But basically the idea is you can have a crappy test that doesn't measure what it's supposed to measure, and it'll show the same results over and over and over again, but it could be a completely invalid test. So for example, if you had a diverse population of people, some of whom are native English speakers, some of whom are not, and the test is only presented in English and only uses cultural representations from the English-speaking populace, doesn't use other kinds of cultural touch points that would be within the knowledge base of these other people who may come from many, many different cultures and not be as familiar with the language. So you could get the same scores every time that show the people who are not native English speakers are not performing well. Does that mean that they're not as intelligent? No. It's a reliable test, but it's not valid because it is not controlled for differences in language. So you can see where the problem would lie. So that concludes part 3.